Hello, everyone. I'm Leonel August Rodriguez, the VP of Business Development for Access Medical Labs. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on another Access Live, where we bring you insight from leading medical experts. We do ask that all questions are submitted via the Q&A, as they will be answered at the end of our lecture. Today, I am honored to present to you an individual who is one of the world's leading experts on diabesity. He is a best-selling author, a researcher, a futurist, a scientist, and an educator. He is a graduate of the University of Witwatersrand Medical School in Johannesburg, Africa. He is board certified in internal medicine, certified in age management medicine, and the founding member of the American Holistic Medical Association. Without further ado, Dr. Graham Simpson.
Yes, good afternoon to everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and Leo, thanks for the introduction. Before we get started, I want to sort of make a point. You know, in 2019, before COVID, America, for the first time, the lifespan of Americans decreased by 2 years and 4 months, and this was before COVID. And I really believe that this is in some ways a tipping point for what I consider the real pandemic, which is metabolic stress, or what many of you know as insulin resistance. So what I'd like to do is share my journey over the last 40 years on 5 different continents. And hopefully, please, any questions, I'd be delighted to ask. So I'm going to get going here. I've written obviously a number of books, and you're more than, if any of you want one or two, just give me a shout and I'll send them off to you. The most important thing, the world is fat, diabetic, and sick. Over half the world's population is now fat, diabetic, and sick, and it's the epidemic of this insulin resistance, which is primarily related to the diet. Refined sugars, refined grains, and particularly vegetable oils. And I would like to make some points on vegetable oils that I've just found out about recently. And I think they are perhaps the worst offenders in our chronic diseases and shortened lifespan. So this is important for all us docs, and some of the docs still haven't connected the dots. Most of the disease that we see every day in our offices around the world, particularly the big 3, the C's, the cardiovascular disease, the neurocognitive decline, and cancer, which kills about more than 90% of us, including everything else on the screen here, is all related actually to metabolic stress and insulin resistance. I like this quote from an ex-pharma rep, that medical schools should be renamed pharma schools. Doctors only learn to treat symptoms with drugs while ignoring the cause. And hopefully in the new doctors' offices of the future, which we're very keen to help democratize healthcare across the country, we will hopefully make some inroads here. Previously, naming the disease, and most doctors, once they name the disease, they write out a few prescriptions, very rarely looking at the underlying cause, which, as you can see, is very much related to insulin resistance. And that's why it's such an important topic that I believe I'm sharing with you today. Just to go over this, 80% of these diseases, these so-called cardiometabolic diseases I've just mentioned, is really the 21st century and global pandemic all over the world. Just to give you an idea, 80% of people in the USA die from these cardiometabolic diseases. 88% of Americans over 20 have insulin resistance. It's actually 93% from a recent study. 53%, again, this is closer now to 60% of Americans either have diabetes or pre-diabetes. This is just astonishing to me. And 80% of all these healthcare costs, which I think in 21 was $4.3 trillion. And we don't turn up very well on the world health experts. We were about number 41. So the major cause, I believe, of aging and premature death is very much related to insulin resistance. Obviously, our genes haven't changed for hundreds of thousands of years, but our environment has tremendously changed. You know, for 2.5 million years, there were small bands of people on the earth, and most were obviously hunter-gatherers. Only about 13,000 years ago, we developed agriculture. And only 10 generations have eaten a Western-style diet. And obviously one generation, a very high fructose corn syrup diet, and where the vegetable oils have reached epidemic proportions. The first disaster, I want to give a little history of why we are in this mess. The Middle East began domesticating animals and cultivating grasses or grains about 10,000 plus years ago. And obviously we moved away from our hunting, fishing, and gathering to this type of diet. The second disaster was Ansel Keys. I believe that he is responsible for not only the tremendous amount of chronic disease we have in America, but all over the world, because whatever we did here, we exported, and Keys exported. He basically came up with a false diet heart hypothesis. Basically, it was a plumbing problem due to cholesterol. This was and has been largely disproved. I want to just make a point, because I know many of you are still, I think, believers of the cholesterol diet heart hypothesis of Ansel Keys. A very important point is that we should only be cooking with butter, ghee, beef fat, coconut oil, avocado oil, primarily. And these are, most of this we've been cooking for hundreds of thousands of years when we had this type of fat. The vegetable fats, the only time, as I'll point out, the only time the LDL cholesterol is dangerous is when it gets oxidized. And the best way to oxidize this LDL cholesterol is with these vegetable oils. And as many of you know, Keys never saw a single patient in his life. The other important thing is it's very difficult to believe what's published now in medical articles. I mean, this is John Ioannidis from Stanford. And, you know, he's saying that as much as 90% of published medical information that doctors rely on are deeply flawed. And this is mostly because of tremendous vested interest, particularly by big pharma, big food, and big agri business. So this is another huge stumbling block for many of us physicians. Here's current nutritional orthodoxy. You know, cholesterol, especially LDC, LDL is dangerous. Cholesterol is dangerous. Now, as I pointed out, in the nascent form, LDL cholesterol in the native form is completely harmless. And there are over 19 well-documented studies to show that. In fact, the higher the cholesterol is, including the LDL cholesterol, particularly over the age of 50, the longer you live. Saturated fats clog your arteries. They don't. Diabetes can be managed but not cured. Not true. We are curing diabetes now in several weeks. Exercise for weight loss, it does many good things, but doesn't help with weight loss. Obviously, calories in, calories out, that's also old nutritional thinking. A calorie, obviously, of Wonder Bread is not the same as, a celery or spinach or something else. Breakfast, most important meal of the day, is probably least important. Best several small meals a day. I know I was guilty of doing this in my early days, but not good. Eating fat makes you fat. Not true. Eating fat makes you thin. You need healthy carbs for energy. The only macronutrient we don't need is carbohydrates. So what was the result of Keys and what was happening? Basically, the US guidelines told Americans to drop their fat intake to 35% and to increase carbs to 55%. And if you look at the graphs, you can see what a disaster, unintended consequence this was. The other fourth disaster is Nixon had asked Earl Butz, who became Secretary of Agriculture, to bring down the cost of food that everyone was complaining about at the time, and also to increase the wealth of farmers who were also under some stress at that time. And he gave huge subsidies of corn and soy. And this caused an increase in carbs, and obviously all the cattle we eat the same corn and soy oils that are not good for us. GMO foods have a much higher usable carbohydrate content, more rapidly assimilated, and obviously hurts our microbiome as well. So just to look at nature and looking at mammals, all mammals eat different natural foods. You can see the giraffe, bamboo shoots for the koala, lion, we know what they eat. So this is important. We now know that something like 93% of Americans fail to meet and optimize their biomarkers for metabolic health. Nearly 1 in 2 people now have metabolic syndrome. This is also important. Metabolic syndrome should actually be renamed the fat storage hormone, because in most animals, this is actually a normal development to conserve fat during lean times. And I will show you some examples. Obviously, this is work by Dr. Richard Johnson, but in addition to Darwin emphasizing the survival of the fittest, there's also the concept of survival of the fattest. As you know, bears eat a large amount of fruits and other salmon and other things before they hibernate. And during their hibernation, they're essentially living off their fat and producing ketones, which is a really clean fuel when you compare it to glucose. And they become insulin resistant and pre-diabetic. Hummingbirds or big whales, it doesn't matter the size of these animals, they all become, and a hummingbird, for instance, develops some fatty liver during the day and then it's gone by the next morning. So male emperors is another very good example. They eat a high diet of squid and fish during the summer, and then they march inland where the male basically hatches the egg. But the male penguin can actually survive for 4 months without any food, and he's basically, again, living off his fat and the ketones. Uric acid is one of the cardinal concerns of Gerald Raven, who described metabolic syndrome. Uric acid is very toxic to the mitochondria. A great book to read, if you haven't read it, is David Perlmutter's book called Drop Acid, which is all about the role of uric acid. Uric acid, remember, only comes from 3 main sources: fructose, alcohol, and purines. Those penguins eating a lot of fish and squid, they're very high in purines, and they actually increase the uric acid to help with the food. It's interesting that humans have lost uricase, the enzyme that probably 30 million years ago, because it was probably enhanced our ability to live with very small amounts of food. So animals then activate the fat switch and allows them to gain weight and to be able to hibernate, to hatch the eggs of penguins, etc., etc. Obese humans, unfortunately, have not turned or learned to turn the fat switch off, and it's stuck in this on position. And together with now most Americans eating 75% of ultra-processed food, this is the underlying cause of what we see today. It also, the fats, which explains why some substances, nuts, oils, chocolate, are actually quite healthy and prevent disease. I should say something about nuts. Nuts are also very high in omega oils and polyunsaturated fats, and often are somewhat rancid. And different nuts have different amounts of linoleic acid. Linoleic acid is the major 90% of omega-6 is linoleic acid, and this turns out to be very, very toxic. In 1865, after the Civil War, the average person's linoleic acid in the 1900s as well was very low, about less than 1%. Linoleic acid now is up to 11.8% as of 2010, and is terribly toxic to the mitochondria. So the fat switch resides in our mitochondria, and when it's on, we preferentially shunt the energy from food to fat. This is why many people who are overweight are hungry all the time, eating more than they need, and also exercising a lot less because of the fatigue. John Yudkin is important because he really showed the association of sugar with heart disease. In fact, I believe, many of us believe, that most people having heart disease are either pre-diabetic or diabetic. And Joseph Kraft later sort of proved that. So he and Ansel Keys was a bit of a bully. This gentleman was a mild guy working at Queen's College in England, and Keys managed to get him banned from certain lectures around the world and things. And anyway, it's an interesting thing too. And while Keys was being basically paid by the sugar companies, it's a terrible blight of health. So this is just in the UK. They had some of the best, but you can see back in 1700, the average person was eating 5 pounds. Even after the Civil War, here in the US, people were probably eating roughly 20-25 pounds of sugar. This is what is recommended by many of the people today, that a woman should not have more than 6 teaspoons of sugar, total sugar a day, and a man not more than 9 teaspoons. Well, you can imagine in one Coke, there's 11 teaspoons of sugar. In a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, there's 6 teaspoons. So that's pretty much max for a woman and too much for a man if drinking a Coke. When I was in Dubai in the Middle East, the average soda, and this was about 8 years ago, the average soda intake in the UAE was 310 cans of sodas per year. So also important, most of the docs don't know, how many grams of carbs are in a lot of these common foods. All of these foods, a medium banana, very high in sugars, half a cup of rice, pizza, bagel, glass of milk, juice, Coke, etc. So very high. Also very important with another important fact to note, that the lower the fat in the diet is and the higher the carbohydrates, all due to our friend Ansel Keys, the smaller and denser the LDL particles. And as you know, many people are now using NMR and looking at the actual particle sizes. But here it is, 10% fat, 2 out of 3 men have atherogenic profile, 35%, 1 in only 3, and with 46% fat, 1 in 5. And, I was very guilty of a high-carb diet. I thought this was going to control all our heart disease, and obviously it didn't. So obviously we made, I think, a huge mistake. And everyone, I think, on the call knows all about insulin resistance. This is also a very important work by Joseph Kraft. He's recently died. He was from Chicago. But this is the single best way to see if you're insulin resistance. A 2-hour and 3-hour, this is much more sensitive than doing a glucose tolerance test. You want to look at the insulin, and if the 2-hour and 3-hour sum is less than 60 micrograms, you're okay, microunits, I should say. So this is the only normal dynamic insulin pattern that is healthy. Obviously, food addiction, hyperpalatable foods. Just so you know what processed foods are, when you hear processed foods, it's really 4 ingredients. It's refined sugars, refined grains, vegetable oils or seed oils, and trans fats. Trans fats, they are trying to eliminate, but all the oils still, and all these hyperpalatable processed foods, they are still full of trans fats, which we know are terribly, terribly toxic. We've also got people like this guy, Dr. Howard Moskowitz, who actually does tests on people to find out what the actual right combination of sugar and salt and fats are to keep people eating, say, Pringle chips. Most people can't eat one chip. They eat the whole bloody can. So this guy's made billions of dollars consulting, and I'm sure there are a couple of his fellow types that do this. So I'm talking about a new health model here, and I think many of you know about proactive health. It's got the 4 Ps. It's personalized, it's preventive, and therefore, well, it's predictive, and therefore preventive, and also participatory. We're moving away from reactive disease medicine to a much more proactive era. Also very important to see this. You can see here, as the amount of carbs go up, you get fat, and you get severe cardiometabolic disease when you're eating over 300 grams of carbs a day. You can still eat to keep your body fat where it is, easy weight maintenance, less than 150 grams. Obviously, keto, we like folks to eat less than 50. Paleo is more for maintenance, and you have a little more. So these are important numbers just to keep in mind. Now, this is an interesting thing from Chris Konobe, the gentleman who just wrote this book, and I would encourage everyone to really read his book. I think it's a tremendously important book. And what he shows is that, for instance, the Maasai in Africa, who many of you have heard of, they have one of the highest saturated fats diets in the world, 66%. And yet they are in excellent health and pretty much free of any cardiovascular disease. And the Turkey Center, who are from Papua New Guinea, have the highest carbohydrate diet in the world, 94.6% carbohydrates. Obviously, these are natural, traditional, ancestral type of diets that these people are eating. But it shows you that it's not so much the macronutrient content that is that important. It's more related to the amount of processed foods, and specifically the vegetable oils that you're consuming. Intermittent fasting, very important. I think many of us have realized the tremendous advantages of intermittent fasting. This is a recent study from January by the people at the Salk researchers in San Diego, and they showed that a typical 8-hour, 9-hour fast with these 2 groups of mice, that the mouse who were fasted, 70% of the genes respond to intermittent fasting. And they also showed that circadian rhythms in multiple organs in the body were improved. Now, we use a number of, the keto type diets and these type of diabetes reversal programs, these Libre Freestyle monitors and the Keto Mojo. I'm not that crazy about Biosense. I get different readings with that, but the Freestyle Libre and Keto Mojo can be tremendously helpful to your clients because it gives them immediate feedback to let them know how they're doing on their program. And obviously, we can integrate it, and that's what we've done with a dashboard and an app, and we can keep track of people and send them and message them, etc. So obviously, a high-fat diet to achieve high-fat, low-carb, and particularly cutting down the processed foods with the vegetable oils, intermittent fasting, we find the 16-8 hours is most successful. And then we have certified coaches who are in contact with clients all the time. It can be supervised by a physician, and we monitor the clients. We send them articles, recipe blogs, and videos and books, etc. And a very important thing that we are doing now in the last 2 years is we measuring methylation data. And you can actually see the change in biological age before and after a person restores. When they restore their metabolic flexibility and insulin sensitivity, the biological age changes. And so we use a company, True Diagnostic, and 2 drops of blood, you get tremendous data, including your pace of aging. You can actually see if you're aging slowly or more rapidly by using this type of data. I want to say something about mitochondria, because they are really the key to not only diabetes and chronic disease, but they also hold the key to longevity. So these organisms evolved probably 2 billion years ago. And the interesting thing is, over time, a symbiotic relationship existed between bacteria that they joined with. Part of the mitochondria was looking for food. The other part was basically focusing on using the food for energy. And over time, this symbiotic arrangement allowed multicellular life, essentially all life, to evolve. And a very important organelle. Most people also don't realize that more than 10% of your body weight is mitochondria. You've got hundreds of mitochondria and often thousands in your heart and brain, because obviously these are the areas that you're consuming more energy. But you can see a single brain neuron uses 4.7 billion. I don't know how they come up with these numbers, but these are fairly accepted numbers of what energy usage looks like in the human body. Now, what do mitochondria actually do? They regulate all metabolism very broadly. They regulate neurotransmitters. They're very important for immune function. They regulate the stress response, very important, releasing most of the hormones. They also produce reactive oxygen species, but they also clean them up. Fission, fusion, epigenetics, which we talked about, mitochondrial biogenesis, building new mitochondria, neuroplasticity in the brain, autophagy, mitophagy, and apoptosis, very important to get rid of our senescent cells. So mitochondria are critically important in chronic disease and longevity, and very damaged, particularly by the mitochondria. I mean, by the vegetable oils, I should say. So I'll say a few words. I'd like to leave some time for questions. I know I went through probably fairly rapidly, but hopefully we can have engaging conversations. I wanted to just end with a few things about introducing Live Below 5. We have a company, Live Below 5 100. And obviously, we're very much about reversing obesity and diabesity, and also reversing cardiometabolic disease. What is Live Below 5? We like to get the hemoglobin A1C below 5, reversing type 2 diabetes. Insulin, we like levels below 5, reducing inflammation, and obviously uric acid, which is very toxic to the mitochondria. We also like that to be 5, less than 5. Obviously, I'll talk a little bit about Era 1, Era 2, and Era 3 medicine, but basically we can do a very easy, inexpensive, free test for people just with some history and some measurements, height, weight, waist circumference, etc., relative fat mass. And we can tell them whether they are insulin resistant or not, and then they can obviously get some blood tests to confirm it. And we actually build to a longevity program. So that's why it's called Live Below 5 to live beyond 100. No one gets to 100 if you've got diabetes or pre-diabetes. So level 1, I should say something about what are these 3 eras of medicine. Era 1 medicines really started after the Civil War. You know, before that, even I was reading the first president, he got sick with quinsy, and they were doing bloodletting just before a decade or so before the Civil War. But anyway, the point is, Era 1 medicine is what's practiced in most places around the world today. It's biological or mechanistic medicine that's going on. Level era 2 medicine is a mind-body medicine. And obviously, I believe, and many people do, Chris Palmer and others, that most mental disease, all the way from anxiety and depression, all the way to psychosis, schizophrenia, major depression, is really all related to the energy in the brain, the mitochondria, how they're functioning in the brain. And these are very important, because the whole object, if you look at, for instance, the blue zones, of the 9 common dimensions of longevity in people around the world, 5 of them are actually more mental and 4 of them are more physical. So mind-body sort of connections and all the hallmarks of aging are affected by this metabolic stress. But the era 2 medicine is really about brain body medicine. You know, a lot of people equate the mind to the brain, but people consider it's just the functioning of the physiology and the chemistry in the brain. That's what mind is. So there is interchangeability. Era 3 medicine was made popular somewhat by a friend of mine, Dr. Larry Dosey, and as opposed to era 1 and 2, I'm not talking about it now, but just to let you know, era 3 medicine is about mind that is non-local. In other words, it's space-free and time-free, which I know takes a little bit of getting used to, but that I believe is the future of medicine, but we're not quite there yet. So I think we will go through the era 1, do it properly by reversing all this metabolic stress, move on to a lot of the longevity practices that are becoming very, popular nowadays, cellular senescence, the stem cells, all the different therapies, the different NMN, all the NAD, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, that's a little bit about that. We use, and we have used for more than 20 years, this integral approach, which is really much like Jeffrey Bland's, who was really the father of functional medicine. He had 7 systems that look for the root causes rather than just writing out a prescription. So this is the integral model that we use. It's inflammation control, nutrition, metabolism, toxins, and cancer reduction, exercise, sleep, the gut microbiome, the restoration of hormones, adequate supplements, and lifetime mindfulness and stress reduction. But that is what we include in the Diabesity program. This is just a little bit about the program. We've got good certified training that can happen. People can be certified in just a few weeks. And we've got products to support it. We've got the software and et cetera. And we also have a LB100RX, which has a lot of the products and hormones, et cetera. This is just what's in our little starter kit for the Reverse Diabesity program. It's got a couple of my books. It's got a Keto Mojo and a continuous glucose monitor, a few products, and a body fat scale, and the software, et cetera, for the app. So, and that's how we get to the dashboard. And so maybe I can leave you with this slide. If you want to get some information about what we do and how we do it, we'd love anyone who's interested. You can do this from your own home and see clients once you're a certified practitioner, or you can easily add this on to your clinic or practice and run it from the practice, but it's your choice, and we can send you the information and what it looks like. You contact Beth at lb5100.com. If you want my phone number, I can give it to you if anyone would like to call and talk to me. It's 702-882-0278. I think that's the last slide. Thanks very much. I'll hand this back to Leo.
Dr. Simpson, excellent, excellent. I mean, very, very informational. We have quite a few questions. If you do have questions to the audience, this is the time to ask them on the Q&A. The first question, how would you read a uric acid result as it pertains to fat accumulation?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think there's obviously a correlation. I mean, usually people that are more overweight usually have a higher uric acid. I mean, a uric acid in a woman should actually be no more than 3.5. And in a man, I'm talking about optimum ranges, and in a man, not more than 4.5. We take a level of under 5 is what we're shooting for. The other thing is that I want to make also a good question that the person has asked. The other thing is, I've noticed throughout, most places that I visit, doctors' offices and places, they don't have a way of measuring body fat unless you've got a DEXA scan, which I had in my office. There's simple impedance devices by InBody, for instance, that are actually very accurate. I had a little impedance device and compared it to my DEXA scan and was within 1 or 2 percent points. So I think it's essential that people have a body fat, and, men should be less than 20% fat and women less than 28%. I mean, that's a normal body fat. Most of the people I see, or many of the people I see, are way up there, 35%, 45%, or even over 50%, like a block of butter. So
Wow.
I wish maybe there's some information out there that correlates directly the uric acid with a percent body fat.
Excellent. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the actual, but I'd be curious if anyone has information on that. But a good question.
Excellent. And you actually answered another question, which was, what is the ideal or suggested body fat in both male and females? And to recap, that was less than 20 in males and less than 28% in females, correct?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, women, obviously, fat distribution is usually a little different also in women. It's more pear-shaped around their hips and thigh areas and buttock areas. And men, as you know, particularly as they get older, and this is a very bad sign, they get that visceral fat and they fat like an apple. And this is the toxic fat that is related to, vascular disease as well.
Excellent. And since we're on the topic of measuring, here's another question, and I believe you touched on this already. The best test that you have found to test for biological age.
Yeah, I mean, we have and a number of my colleagues have become very interested in looking at these tests. Steve Horwath from UCLA came out with one of the first age clock measurements, which was done in 2013, which was, the first step in the right direction. Then we had Morgan Levine, a lady who was at Yale. She came out with one in about 2018 called PhenoAge, which again wasn't so much looking at the biological age, but it did sort of give some indication of the health of the person, and because it was really looking at more also at chronological age. The best single test that I know of is from True Diagnostic. Ryan Smith, who's the founder of the company, we've been using for about 2 or 3 years. And we find it very, very effective. And they've upgrading it now with using also a lot of clinical data, which they will have out in their new age clock, I think, in the next few weeks. But, right now you can get a fantastic report. You get 2 drops of blood. They'll send you a kit at home, and you will see, a lot of different, not only, like I said, your biological age that's, somewhat accurate, and you can see a change often in 4 to 6 months. And that's why we're very excited about using some of that methylation data to see how, lowering and restoring your metabolic sensitivity, what it does to your biological age.
Excellent. And since we're on tests, this is a slide that you did discuss. So the best blood tests you suggest to determine insulin resistance, and what times and how is the frequency when you do test?
Yeah, I mean, The standard blood test for, diabetes and pre-diabetes, as everyone knows, is hemoglobin A1C. And obviously, if you're under 5.7, you're okay. Once you get to 5.7 to 6.4, you're pre-diabetic, and above that, and usually with that, you are insulin resistant. But I can tell you, if you just stand in front of your mirror and jump up and down, and if your belly you see the belly fat moving, you're insulin resistant. Now, the question is, you can measure, I quite like using the HOMA-IR score, which is very easy to do. It's a fasting sugar times your fasting insulin divided by 405. And ideally, you should be less than 1.2. In my experience, and also in the published data, it shows that 93% people, 93% of people are insulin resistant, and they are actually on their way to an early grave. This is the issue that needs to be diagnosed and reversed, and it's very easy to reverse, and we've shown that time and time again. It's very easy, but not by following the American Diabetes Association. You have to, high fat, low carb works absolutely. Intermittent fasting, good sleep, a little exercise. A few men need their testosterone also adjusted, because it's very effective in lowering your sugar. So we use a very integrated, it's the integral approach that we use. We look at all that. Sometimes it's toxins that screws up your insulin. So getting back to the question, what is the best test? Without doubt, the best test is to do a 3-hour Joseph Kraft, where you have the client drink sugar and you measure their fasting insulin, the insulin as over a couple of hours of 3 hours. And like I said, if the 2-hour plus the 3-hour levels are less than 60 microunits, you've got good insulin sensitivity. If it's anything above that, it's abnormal. And so that is the single best test.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And on the topic of testosterone and diet, so do you believe that our current diet is affecting testosterone levels in males?
Absolutely. And it's not just that. It's, there's a great book that this person should read called Countdown by Shayna Swan. She's actually shows that in the last 4 decades, our testosterone and sperm counts have gone down 54%. Wow. And she believes it's primarily due to the incredible pollution. The water's polluted, the sand, the soil, all the bloody vegetables and everything is causing a major problem. Lack of sleep. Nearly a third of Americans are now only sleeping 5 hours. Lack of sleep is a tremendous problem that lowers your stress. I was in Dubai for a couple of years, and, when there was this financial crisis, I saw a lot of young guys, and man, their testosterone's plummeted. So, there are quite a few things, but the diet itself, absolutely. I think with all these processed foods that people are eating now, everything, 75% of the food sold now is all processed food. People are eating away from home. In the old days, 95% of the meals were all done at home and made from scratch. So, a lot of these, little TV dinners that are coming in, these things are all full of bloody processed oils. And I really cannot stress this guy's book, Chris. I just met him 3 weeks ago at a conference in San Diego for 5 minutes, but his talk was so engaging. I had the book bought before I even got home and finished it in 2 or 3 days. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And he has hard data. He used a thing called the Austin Bradford Hill 9 criteria to show that it's not just observational. This was causative. And the Japanese, he really cites as the quintessential sort of country to see what's happened, because sugar, even in this country, sugar has been going down over the last decade. And what's happening is these vegetable oils keep going through the roof. So there's the biggest problem, and it's so ubiquitous. This, so I mean, he gives some good suggestions, but you know, you cannot, like I said, you cannot cook with any of these vegetable oils. You know, no grapeseed oils or any of these canola or Crisco. I mean, you know, Procter and Gamble introduced Crisco back in, I don't know, 1912 or whenever it was. But you know, cottonseed was the first oil that came into the American diet. But these oils are absolutely toxic. They're poisoning our mitochondria and they're shortening our lives. And we have to get a handle on this, and particularly the young kids. I mean, all they eat is all this crap. So anyway, I better stop there with that one. So okay.
Couldn't agree more. Can you repeat the name of the author? It was Chris, and what was his last name and the
Yes,
name of the book?
his name is Kenobi. I always think of Obi Kenobi, but it's Knobbe. And he's got a foundation as well. He's a really good guy. And I was surprised he's an ophthalmologist who left his practice about 10 or 11 years ago. And all he's done is put together this incredible book with about 1,320 references. It was absolutely mind-blowing, you know, showing how our traditional ancestral diets, we were healthy, you know, and people say, well, these guys all died. No, if you got past the age of 15, a lot of these traditional places, like the Aborigines of Australia, are people who have been the longest lived people on the planet, probably 50,000 years. So it's amazing. I mean, there's fascinating articles about how you put these people back in their original conditions, and man, most of the chronic disease they have, it all disappears. We do not need a drug for everybody ailment. So yeah, I would really strongly encourage everyone to read his book. I think it's going to be a big eye opener for many of us, not just here in America, but elsewhere as well.
Excellent. So again, Chris Kenobi is the name of the author. And my last question. So just to confirm, it's more so not how we're eating, it's more so what we're eating, right? Going back to your data points, there was a few charts that you showed with the Aborigines eating 90-something% carbs, but living very healthy lives. So it's more so what we are consuming, not necessarily, you know.
Yeah, I was just making a point between the macronutrients. I mean, you know, the only macro, you know, obviously protein, carbs, and fat are the only macronutrient we don't need at 1 gram of is carbohydrates. But we obviously need fat and we need protein. But you know, a lot of, you know, the talk that happens around is about, well, you know, what's the percentage of carbs and fat and protein that you should eat ideally, etc. What I think Chris Kenobi showed was, you know, with the two extremes, the Maasai who have 66% cholesterol, you know, diets, and then you have these people in Papua New Guinea, these are original traditional diets, and they're eating, you know, 94% carbohydrates, and they're both in excellent health, pretty much free of all chronic disease. And his point is that it doesn't really make all that much difference in the, you know, in the carb and the, at least in the this carb and fat content. It's really related to how much processed food is in the diet, and particularly these vegetable oils. The linoleic acid is the big offender.
Excellent. So the key is the processed foods.
Yeah, processed foods, which obviously includes refined grains, refined sugar. It includes obviously these toxic seed vegetable oils. And I can't believe the, you know, American Heart Association is still telling people to eat lots of, you know, healthy vegetable oils. It's criminal. Yeah.
It is very sad. But Dr. Simpson, that wraps up the questions. On behalf of Access Medical Labs, I'd like to thank you for an incredibly informative lecture on diabesity and the 4-week cure. You already have your information on the screen for our audience. To our audience, thank you for tuning in to another Access Live, where we bring you insight from leading medical experts such as Dr. Simpson. Don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time. Thank you all.
Thanks, Leo. Thank you.
Thank you.